Hello, and welcome to the Snack and Learn webinar, Rethinking Social and Environmental Compliance Through an ESG Lens, presented by myself, Jessica Barua, and Doug McNeil. Before we get started with today's session, just a couple of housekeeping items. We will be taking questions at the end of the session, so please submit your questions directly in the questions box in the GoToWebinar platform. Also, the presentation slide deck is available in the GoToWebinar platform, and you can download that from the handouts box. Before we get to the session today, we'll briefly introduce ourselves. So I'm going to turn it over to Doug to introduce himself first.
Yes, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Doug McNeil. I'm a principal ESG EHS compliance consultant with WSP. I have more than 35 years of experience in building, designing, and implementing and stress testing environmental and social systems. I've done that kind of work on 4 continents, and my greatest passion is ensuring the capacity development of the individuals responsible for these systems. Jessica.
Great, thanks, Doug. And my name is Jessica Barua. I am a senior occupational hygienist with the Mine, Water, Environment, EHS, and IH team here at WSP. I have over 10 years of experience managing projects in environment, health, and safety and occupational hygiene. And I have the privilege today to speak to you about one of our project examples that we'll get to later in the session today. So this is the agenda for today's session. So we'll start off with giving you an overview of the WSP ESG Compliance Services. We'll then explore compliance and with legal and other ESG requirements. Then we'll understand the drivers for these other ESG requirements. And then lastly, we'll explain how these key ESG elements help improve performance. And this is where we'll provide a project example as well. And as mentioned at the beginning, we will take questions at the end, so please drop them in the questions box. So Doug, I'll turn it over to you to speak about our ESG compliance services.
Excellent, thank you, Jessica. The design of these ESG compliance services had 2 fundamental objectives in mind. The first objective was services that help our clients improve performance. We do that through our governance design systems. And ultimately, this messaging is about decluttering, integrating, and building on existing systems that our clients already have for social and environmental. The other key objective for these services is helping to verify performance. We feel that we're going to talk about this in the ESG ecosystem, but we feel that there's going to be lots of increased pressure on organizations to prove that they're performing to what they're saying publicly related to ESG performance. And we're doing that through two service lines. One is through our auditing services, and the other one through our ESG due diligence services, specifically designed to deal with this growing amount of regulation around the world to deal with due diligence in supply chains. Next slide, please. So I introduced you to our ESG house. The first thing I want to orientate individuals to is a statement by the International Organization of Standards, ISO. The statement is evaluating compliance with legal and other requirements. So fundamental to ISO management systems has always been that corporations, when they're managing social and environmental risks and opportunities, that they start with legal first and ensure compliance with their local laws, and then build upon other requirements. And these other requirements will be part of our discussion here. But ultimately, the first and foremost step is establishing the floor of rights. So we can't stress enough that these other requirements are not a replacement of domestic environmental and social laws. Governments still have an important and key role to play to implement these laws and enforce these laws. But the messaging we want to indicate is that the compliance with local domestic laws is the starting point. It's not an end point. It's the floor in which you build your ESG house on. The next critical step is understanding what the risk and opportunities as it relates to social, environmental, and governance are based on your business activities. In some cases, based on your business activities, you have to go beyond those fundamental requirements in law. And the third critical element here is stakeholders. And we're going to talk a little bit in one of the slides about stakeholder capitalism, but there is an increased pressure to ensure that you're using, engaging your key stakeholders within your complete value chain. And those include employees, customers, communities. I constantly get asked, Doug, my leadership will not let us go past basic legal compliance. So we're going to go into the next slide to answer that question for you. So before we get to these key drivers, and these are real pressure points that are occurring real time now, I just want to point to the fact that this is what we're referring to as ESG criteria. So you see within each one of the environment, governance, and social baskets, there's the type of indicators or criteria that you will use, again, based on your business activities. So performance driver number one, access to and pricing of both capital and insurance. So first and foremost, for a number of years now, there's been a concept called the Equator Principles. It's a collection of banks that have established a risk management framework, and they have established guidelines associated with managing environmental and social risks with the capital that's being deployed. The other key point that I talked about here before was the issue of stakeholder capitalism. In a recent conference here in Toronto, the Canadian Coalition for Good Governance had an open discussion on what that means in the Canadian context and the global context. And even though there's no legal standing for moving beyond shareholder capitalism, there is a increased pressure, and boards should be aware that that the voices of these other stakeholders are important to ensuring long-term value of an organization. I think the second driver is probably the most dynamic and fast moving right now. So within this is we have increasing ESG regulation, so international soft law becoming domestic hard law. We're seeing this in two spaces particularly, disclosure regulations. So we're seeing climate related disclosures be regulated by domestic security regulators. And then the other key area we're seeing is things like international labor rights, international human rights being deployed through supply chain regulations. And currently in Canada, we just approved a new law, Bill 211, which deals with ensuring that Canadian corporations understand what's within their supply chain as it relates to child and forced labor. The last key driving point here is supply chain. You're going to see increased pressure related to what's in your supply chain and the importance of, depending on the sophistication of what's in your supply chain, you may be asked to demonstrate performance to these. Next slide, please. There's a lot going into the slide, and as Jessica indicated before, these slides are available after post the presentation. But ultimately, we put this slide together because we get constantly asked, what is ESG? How is it new? How is it different? The messaging in the slide is the fact is that ESG is a material subset of some of the amazing work that's gone on before ESG in the area of corporate social responsibility and sustainable development. The next section here, there are 12 reference points, and these are different criteria. I've had the fortunate ability within my career to work with national governments, international corporations, building capacity with Indigenous communities in the Amazon, and building out environmental social governance systems for mining operations in Democratic Republic of Congo. These have been important frameworks to work on to build environmental and social systems. I constantly get asked, so what's different about ESG? What's different about ESG is the role capital markets is playing. This is a significant difference and driver. And we are seeing a fundamental switch from what historically these requirements would be voluntary, moving towards mandatory application. So that's a big switch. And the other thing that we'll talk about, the requirements for ESG data is enormous. Go to the next slide, please. So I take full responsibility for the messiness of this slide. It's a way for us to communicate that there is connectivity between what is going on in the capital markets and what is going on in corporations, and one is influencing the other in dramatic ways. So there are 12 data points on this slide. We will not get to them all, and again, this is available through downloading. So first data point I'll get to is the data point number 1, capital markets. So we're seeing an influx of monies going towards sustainable financial products. And as of 2021, it was around $35 trillion. Has increased, it slowed a little bit in 2022 and in 2023 because of the threat of regulation around these products. I think the true story, the true key data point here on the capital market side is the appetite for ESG data. So Ernst & Young estimated that in 2022, the ESG data market was worth $1.3 billion. So why is this so important? As capital markets get pressure to understand and demonstrate frameworks on how they're integrating ESG into their financial products, there's going to be increased demand for ESG data, and that increased demand will spill over into what corporations are doing. The next data point I'll go to is the importance of international frameworks and standards, influencing both how data is collected on the capital market side and influencing ultimately how organizations are organizing and the elements of the systems that they deploy to manage social and environmental risks. I'll move to data point number 7, related to indicators and targets. The concept of the organization, the Global Reporting Initiative, been around for a great number of years. They have established key metrics and targets related to environmental and social performance. The key messaging here is that comparability, when you start selecting your metrics for your indicators, comparability across the industry, there's going to be more and more pressure related to that. The next data point, a subtle but very important one, is number 8, risk and opportunity frameworks. So most organizations have some type of enterprise risk management association or elements. And what's key here is that these enterprise risk frameworks need to be updated to include ESG related components like climate change, like human rights. The next data point I'll point to is that management systems, those are increasingly in certification and required by some of these international norms. The last data point I'll point to is greenwashing, and you can see it's not associated with the ecosystem at all. And we're going to see increased pressure on that. Particularly, there is a task force opened by the SEC in the US to start prosecuting companies. Jessica, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thanks, Doug. So now let's explore how some of these key ESG system elements that Doug spoke about helps to improve performance. And we'll be doing this through a project example, specifically the Giant Mine Remediation Project. And the project that I'll be speaking to, and I've had the privilege of working on, is the development of an integrated management system. So before I get to speaking about the project itself, just to give you a bit of history and background on the Giant Mine. So it was a former gold mine in Northwest Territories here in Canada, just 5 kilometers north of Yellowknife. The mine was in operation between 1984 and 2004, after which it was the ownership of the mine was transferred to the Government of Canada. And currently, it's Canada's largest mine closure liability, with approximately $4.4 billion in capital expenditure until it's closed. And the biggest hazard and remediation aspect of this particular project is the 237,000 tons of arsenic trioxide that's stored underground, and that has the potential to leach into major freshwater systems. So how has WSP been involved in this? So we've had about a decade-long relationship with this, with the client, and we've so far completed about 120 projects. And one of these projects, as I mentioned in the previous slide, is the development of an integrated management system for environment, health and safety, and community. So let's talk a bit more about what the Giant Mine Remediation Project is doing to improve their ESG performance. So first off, the GMRP team recognized the benefits of developing an integrated approach. As Doug had mentioned in that ESG ecosystem, this integrated approach allowed them to manage their environment, health, safety, and community impacts of their work, allowing them to mitigate their risk effectively, manage their opportunity, and this allowed them to ensure or verify continuous improvement, and ultimately it supports their compliance requirements for both environment, health and safety, and their commitments to the community. So overall, what it does is it improves their employee, stakeholder, rights holder support and engagement. So we'll talk about how each of these key elements came out as we develop this integrated management system in the following slide. So some of the graphics here will look rather familiar. These are some key elements that Doug had spoken about in this ESG ecosystem. So, and I'll tie this back to specific components of the GMRP Environment, Health and Safety Management System. So starting off, what we did is we developed an integrated system for them, an integrated management system, taking the framework from ISO 45001, which is the environment standard, the occupational health and safety standard, ISO 14001, which is the environment standard, and ISO 26000, which is the social responsibility standard. And by developing a framework based on these three ISO standards, we were able to support development of the integrated management system. One of the things that we recognized with this particular project and that the client was doing really well is the deep engagement that they had with their community rights holders, stakeholders, and interested parties. They were in constant communication through workshops, soliciting feedback, and also providing their project updates to the identified community rights holders and stakeholders. They identified a key number of internal and external stakeholders within this project. So there's about 30 interested parties in this particular project, so it's a significant number. They also established risk and opportunity processes for this project. And what we were able to do in this integrated management system is really integrate their risk and opportunity processes. They had different ones at different levels of the project, whether it's high-level project, the operational level at the mine, and also their community opportunities as well. So in this integrated management system, we incorporated three. They also established indicators and targets. So we've worked with the client through a number of workshops to identify what are some of the key indicators and targets through an establishment of an inventory. And this allowed them to look at targets that are both regulatory requirements, but also based on what they have in their commitments that go above and beyond the minimum legal requirements. They'd also established processes for determining legal requirements and other commitments. So what we were able to do for them is establish an inventory of what we called EHSC requirements, which highlighted all of their commitments and their legal obligations within one specific document. So that was captured within the integrated management system. And one of the other components that we established for them is an audit program design for the integrated management system, which is ultimately where we're going with this client, is once they've implemented this management system, we will then audit the integrated management system. So components such as audit scope, audit criteria, audit roles, and what would be the key takeaways have been identified within the management system manual. So all these components tie into the requirement for the giant mine to report into the giant mine oversight body. So there's that legal obligation to report into the GMRP oversight body, which then reports the data and the status of the project directly to the public. So it really highlights going back to that graphic Doug had shared with the ESG ecosystem, on the right-hand side with the corporations, these are areas that we've established for this client through an integrated system, but these are areas that we're very familiar with. So these are components that we're already working with in the ESG ecosystem. So just to summarize, how did WSP support integration of ESG criteria? What we did is we developed and designed an integrated management system that built on the existing capacity of the project. We didn't create anything new for them. They had the specific programs, procedures, policies in place, and what we really did, we what we really did is bring them all together through an integrated process. This allowed us to minimize additional development and implementation efforts. And throughout the process, we involved consultation with the key stakeholders and rights holders. And we're continuing to do that as we're going through the implementation process for the management system. This is involving a number of collaborative efforts and capacity development through which is allowing us to foster stakeholder engagement. And the way we've done this is we've shared information, resources, and knowledge that has really allowed this project to manage their EHSC related risks and opportunities. So overall, implementation of this integrated management system allows for an effective measure and support of the ESG elements that we covered at the beginning of this presentation. So Doug, I'm going to turn it over to you now to summarize some of the key takeaways from our session today.
Great, thanks, Jessica. So 3 fundamentals here in building out your ESG management system and managing those risks. First and foremost, establish the criteria that which you want to develop your system on. That criteria should have a direct relationship to what is material to your business activities, both risk and opportunities. And do not forget about the opportunities. And criteria that's relevant to the stakeholders within your value chain. Once you establish what criteria you want, then you pick the requirements for those for that criteria, and these are performance-related requirements. So you can take a look at international standards and norms. You can take a look at domestic consensus-based standards. You can take a look at industry association requirements. There's a number of places to source for these requirements, but it's important to match your criteria to your requirements. The third component of this is to integrate. And it's just talking about the project, and we continue to stress with our clients. This is not about building a brand new system from scratch. This is about integrating and building upon what you already have established in your social and environmental and government systems, but build upon them based on these other things. I think we're good.
Great. Thanks, Doug. So now we are open to take some questions.
Thank you, Doug and Jessica, for a fantastic presentation. I will mention briefly the housekeeping items again. The presentation slides are available to download in the handout box on the GoToWebinar control panel, and also please continue to log your questions in the question box. I will start with a question, basic but equally important. Where do I start my ESG journey?
Doug, I'll turn that one over to you.
Thanks. So first of all, I think it's important that you understand and inventory the system you have in place to manage your existing. So take a look at your own system first. The second thing is that once you engage your stakeholders within your value stream and understand the risks that both the impacts that your business activities have on people and planet, as well as the potential impacts that people and planet have on your business practices. Inventory those first, and then move up on criteria based on, again, those 2 things, stakeholders and risks.
Thank you. Why is an integrating system important to ESG?
Yeah, thanks, Sharon. So I'll take that one. So we've highlighted this throughout the session today. Having an integrated approach, first of all, it builds on your existing capacity. You're not having to create something new. These are already systems, for instance, and if you've already have an existing management system, you can build on that. So it reduces the amount of effort, implementation effort of creating something new. So having an integrated approach really targets the requirements for ESG, but it also builds on what you currently have. So you're not having to build something new.
Thank you. The next question is about international standards and frameworks. Do you have any international and standard frameworks to recommend on?
Yeah, so very much the ones that should be oriented, first of all, the Task Force on Climate-Related Disclosure, TCFD, very important for climate-related. I would definitely point to, put those in the slides, the Sustainable Accounting Board, so SASB standard. And what's important about SASB standard is their terminology related to what's material, and they have a materiality matrix that's publicly available, so you understand that within your system what's important to you. A couple other things I would point to is the OECD guidelines for multinational corporations. I think that, and it's just been updated as of 2023. So those are three that I would point to as starting reference point.
Fantastic, thank you. And next question is about stakeholder engagement. What are the key considerations when engaging with our relevant stakeholders?
Yeah, that's a great question. So stakeholders, obviously, we know it's a key component in order to drive this ESG performance. So first off, the key component would be to identify who are your key stakeholders and identify how you can incorporate them into your ESG strategy. So how can we engage them, whether it's through workshops, whether it's through setting up specific targets or indicators, through continuous engagement, and then reporting back to them. So providing them feedback based on how it's progressing, how the ESG strategy is progressing. So first of all, it's really important to identify them, and it's really important to maintain constant engagement throughout the process.
Thank you. I will take the last question. How do I convince my leadership to move past basic regulatory compliance?
So we addressed some of this in the slides, but I would go back to just talking about those three driving points and show examples of where access to capital is coming with environmental and social strings, and that's occurring. And you can take a look at things like the Equator Principles as an example, or do a search on stakeholder capitalism and see what's moving on that. The second pressure point is that there is clear evidence provided that international soft law, some of these frameworks are becoming domestic hard law. So take a look at what's going on related to security regulations within your jurisdiction as it relates to disclosing climate change related risks, as well as things like the Modern Slavery Act that's been employed in a number of jurisdictions around the world. But take a look at the due diligence obligations that's coming out of those. And directly linked to those are, international norms like the International Labour Organization and the UN's principles related to human rights. So three pressure points: access to capital, domestic law, and then the third one is related to what's happening in your supply chain. That's what I would say. And those are real elements.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. We're exactly 30 minutes into this webinar, so we will wrap up the session now. Please feel free to follow up with the presenters via the contact details shown on the screen. And thank you, Doug and Jessica, for a fantastic presentation. Thanks, everyone, for joining us today. Apologies, we didn't have time to cover all your questions. This will be answered directly by the presenters. So thanks again, everyone.
Great. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.